right? So we know historically communities have had great economic mobility due to the fact that they own a car. And so when you think about now trying to promote sustainable principles, we want to make sure that that's not restricting the economic mobility of groups, particularly those who have not benefited from that type of upward mobility. And so when it comes to, I think, trying to reduce single occupancy trips or car ownership, we really have to be intentional to make sure that there is an alternative mode of transportation that offers the same type of mobility. And if that does not exist, then I think we need to be very careful about how we penalize car ownership, and making sure that we're not, balancing sustainability on the backs of those who really may need that upward mobility the most. Um, and so that means that we have to, if we're going to be limiting car ownership in some way, we need to be investing in what those alternative modes of transportation are. And if we cannot do that, then maybe we do need to consider other motorized ways of providing mobility, whether it be through car shares, even if it's not individual ownership, or making sure that those who are able to afford a car are also able to pay into the modes that are more sustainable and look at how do we balance. I think traditionally we think about, distributional equity, so making sure that our funding, our programs, our policies are being fairly distributed and making sure that those benefits and burdens aren't unfair to particular communities. But there's all these different layers, and I think in the complete streets debate here, one of the issues is really at procedural equity, which is thinking about how do we authentically engage the community and what that process is that develops our programs and policies. So for background, for people who are not from Baltimore, Baltimore passed a complete streets ordinance that sets a modal hierarchy in the city. And so it prioritizes walking first, and then at the lowest level is single occupancy vehicle trips. I believe cycling, transit, micromobility is at that second level, and then taxi, shared mobility, commercial vehicles are at the third level. So, the idea behind that was to, correct the fact that we've been a very auto-generated society, and to try to make sure that when we are putting very limited resources to use, that we are also thinking about, pedestrians and cyclists and other forms of transportation. So here, unfortunately, complete streets has kind of become synonymous for bike infrastructure. And there is concerns about who bike infrastructure is for and what the process was for installing these facilities and who was being engaged in the process. There's several work, I think, nationally about really just green infrastructure in general and the linkage between gentrification and is it a cause of gentrification? Is it a response to gentrification? And kind of what some of those parallels are. And so in much of the discourse locally about complete streets, it's really been on, who was being talked to when these policies were being made, as opposed to maybe not necessarily breaking down like the policy. So I think pretty much everybody would probably agree that walking, pedestrian safety is important. Everybody would pretty much agree on public transit. You get to the cycling piece, there's probably no agreement on that piece. And so I think a really big part of it was some folks in the community feeling like they were not part of that process and that they didn't have that inclusive engagement, and as opposed to what the policy was aiming to get at. And so I think this really highlights that, you can try to implement equity, like that was kind of the basis of this policy, but in reality, it's much more difficult than what it may seem on paper. And trying to capture all those different elements of equity in how you write a policy and also how you implement it can be quite challenging. Bike infrastructure is relatively new, right? We're pretty new to implementing bike infrastructure. And so because it's new, I think it's something that people are still really adjusting to. And it's being implemented at the same time where folks are seeing changes in the city, changes in terms of who's moving into the city and affordability. And so all those things are kind of happening at the same time, and it's causing some uncomfort. And, we have to keep in mind that these communities are not, that their experience is why they have some of this uncomfort, right? Transportation has not, this has not always been used for good, right? Highways were largely built in lower income, predominantly minority areas. They've seen, those devastating effects on their community. We talk about redlining all the time here in Baltimore. And so there's a natural distrust with transportation projects that we have to, as planners and engineers, recognize and value that, because that is the experience of these communities. Because it has not always been the case that we think about transportation in this sense.